Climate Citizen Lobby there, who I also work with in another space. So happy to have him here. And then Dr. Nikki Sheets, who is from the Center for Urban, sorry, you're the director, you have a really long title, Dr. Nikki. I love it. He works on climate in New Jersey. You can read his title there. But they're gonna really dig in with us on the issues around the certain aspects, not all of the aspects of the policy mechanisms for carbon. We've tried to get a cross section of speakers who can speak from different perspectives on the issue. So this should be a great discussion when we get to the Q&A. So everyone will do their presentations first, and then when we are done with the presentations, we will open it up for Q&A and discussion. So our first speaker this afternoon will be Derek Walker. So the floor is yours. Derek.
Sorry, I'm no longer on mute. Thank you, Tina, and it's really a pleasure to have a chance to talk with this group. I am very interested in learning from you all, and both because of your questions, but also the the insights you have and the feedback that you give to the conversation that you hear today. I think Tina is right. I hope Tina is right that we are in a position to turn a corner with respect to federal action on climate. I think there is good reason to see hope in some of the decisions that have already been made around personnel and around the priorities that have been articulated by the administration. So I'm feeling good about that. But I'm going to spend most of my time today talking a little bit at a high level about where we've come with carbon pricing, and more specifically, the kinds of commitments that I think that the broader advocacy community should be making to make sure that policies are really robust going forward. Tina said it well, carbon pricing has often been thought of as a quote unquote economic solution. You make bad stuff more expensive and there'll be less of it. That's something that's always on its surface seemed like an attractive proposition when we can tell pretty clearly what the bad stuff is. Unfortunately, and I'll be the first to admit, I've been at EDF now for about 15 years. Now I run the whole US climate effort that we have going on both at the federal level and at the state level. It is extremely narrowing to think about climate policy through that lens alone. And the last time we had an opportunity to do something at the federal level, we thought we had an opportunity to do something at the federal level back in 2009 and 2010. That effort was focused almost entirely around putting in place a cap and trade program, which you'll hear later, and maybe I'll say a few things about it now, but you'll hear later what some of the significant concerns are with that kind of an approach. It's not just that that sort of an initiative, as it was conceived in 2009 and 2010, did not center equity and justice, and did not both respond to and seek to ameliorate the systemic issues that are so dire in our society and in our community. It didn't contain, it wasn't even a robust discussion about mechanisms to protect against the increase of pollution in communities that are already burdened by cumulative impacts. So fast forwarding 10 years, I think one of the things that makes me the most hopeful is that regardless of whether you're talking about policies that put a price or a limit on carbon, or if you're talking more broadly about any policy that's intended to cut the pollution that causes climate change, I think it is essential that those same policies also ensure that pollution is reduced in communities where there's an inequitable burden, often because of systemic racism and a combination of policy that has not been well thought out or that failed to acknowledge those concerns. So why has EDF been a champion of carbon pricing in the first place? Well, I said a little bit about the idea of making the bad stuff more expensive. We think about that as kind of a correcting of a market failure. If you take the long view, I think that just if you think about climate pollution on its own, which I don't think we should be thinking about it on its own, but if you were to do so, it is clear that the whole process of arriving at 2020, not just in the US, but in most other parts of the world, has been based on the ability of companies, largely companies, to pollute for free. And that pollution has caused a whole lot of suffering, a whole lot of localized pollution impacts, a whole lot of already evident climate impacts. The reason why our advocacy has been focused on putting a limit and putting a price on carbon as a core feature is because from a global perspective, we believe that regardless of what other values or priorities your policy approaches may be aimed at, we still have to, in some way, find an enforceable way to limit and reduce aggressively climate change pollution, greenhouse gases. In the past, as I said, I think that we and other organizations that have strongly supported carbon pricing have been pretty myopic about the range of different issues that are important to address either before or at the very least concurrently with establishing a carbon pricing regime. I want to also say, because I tend to use the terms interchangeably sometimes, I talk about carbon limits or enforceable limits on pollution. The reason why having some sort of an economy-wide system is so appealing is because it offers the opportunity for the government, whether it's at the federal level or in individual states, to actually establish an enforcement mechanism for keeping pollution at a certain overall pollution at a certain level. And it's that feature, the limit feature, that is the very most important to us, to EDF as advocates. I also think, and I've been very active in conversations with some of you and beyond in the last few years, that because of the moment that we're in now, where we have an opportunity with a supportive administration, we hope will be a supportive administration, we have an opportunity to really reset on climate policy and think about pursuing policies that achieve multiple societal values, that help close the income inequality gap, that help reduce pollution in the most overburdened areas, that drive investment to areas that have been historically marginalized, disinvested, and disenfranchised, and also to make sure that job creation is done in a way where jobs and investments are driven into communities where they're most needed and where the workforce is given the tools needed to actually join the workforce and be successful and prosperous in the future. So I know that the purpose of having this conversation today was just to have kind of a free-flowing dialogue, and I'm really glad to have it. I think we are in an era of, a broad toolkit of different policies. And what I would offer is that organizations like EDF, which is a global environmental organization with almost 800 employees, need to understand that in the past I don't think we've done nearly enough listening and learning from the folks that are on this call and others, and we haven't done nearly enough to incorporate the values that I was just describing into our advocacy. And one of the things that Environmental Defense Fund has committed to within the last year is to taking a hard look at how to make sure that we incorporate equity and justice as a core value and a core outcome in all of our work. And we know that we're going to need a whole lot of help to do that. So I think the final thing I'll say is EDF does support as a concept carbon pricing, but it's all a matter of what the details are. It's all a matter of how much ambition you can have. It's all a matter of how the money is spent and what kind of controls you put in place to make sure that within any sort of a system like that, you're reducing pollution in frontline and fence line communities that have suffered unbelievable burdens heretofore. And so I would say carbon pricing for us is a tool. It is not by any means a panacea. And I think that ultimately we need to pursue a hybrid policy approach so we can not only have the most number of organizations and experts lined up together talking about solutions, but so that we can do the right thing to start to dismantle the systemic issues that are so acute in our country. I think I'll pause there. Hopefully there was some things in there that were useful, and I look forward to conversation and questions.
Great, thank you, Derek. Danny, you're up, and the screen share is available for you to use.
All right. So here we are. Let me just move this around so I can get to presenting. All right. So my name is Danny Richter. I'm the Vice President of Government Affairs for Citizens Climate Lobby, and we're going to talk about owning a carbon tax, how to make the moving parts move for you. So this is what I'd like to accomplish in this presentation. I'd love for you to be familiar with the strong expert preference for carbon pricing. I'd love for you to be able to identify the 4 major decision points that you need to make as you're crafting a carbon tax. And I'd love for you to be able to form preliminary preferences in those choices that reflect your own values. So those are my goals for this presentation. So first of all, I'll talk a little bit more about myself. I'll introduce you to the organization I work for, Citizens Climate Lobby, then talk about why economists like carbon taxes so much. Then we'll talk about making your choices. What are the choices and what do they mean? I'll then focus on the specific carbon price. It's a carbon fee that my organization supports, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. And then we'll finish up with some conclusions, but we'll hold the Q&A until after Dr. Sheets presents. So who is this guy? Well, this is me. My name, in undergrad, I studied environmental geoscience, which is basically geologist. If you can't tell, on the left-hand side there, that's me when I'm kind of embarrassed about how excited I am. What I'm holding in my hand is, it's called a scratchy. This was an internship in the Australian outback. I was working for a gold mine, and you can see the top of that pen.
Danny, I can't see your screen.
You cannot see my screen. I can. Thank you for that.
I can see.
Yeah. You can?
Yeah.
Okay, then it's.
Yeah.
Sure. All right. How about?
I can see your screen. Yep.
Okay. All right.
You're good.
All right. Thank you. So that, like I said, that's when I'm embarrassed about how excited I am. That's magnetite that I just dragged that magnet through the soil and pulled up some magnetite. I'm a geologist. I'm a nerd. And then here, the picture on the right, you can see me. This is the racetrack playa. It's in Death Valley. It's called the racetrack because you can see behind that rock, it looks like a path. So it looks like these rocks are moving. This was a mystery in geology. And if you look closely in that picture, you can see that I am actually losing through that rock on the racetrack playa. So this is me, I'm a nerd. I'm figured out for now. I took my nerddom to the next level, piled it on higher and deeper. This is the first slide in my PhD thesis. I studied marine biogeochemistry. It's a real word. I swear I didn't just make it up. But that's my thesis slide. I went to grad school because I was concerned about climate, and I thought that understanding climate of the past would help me affect policy change. It only took me 7.5 years to finish, but I did get to go to all 7 continents in that time and got married. So, time well spent. And then while I was doing this, I was working for Citizens Climate Lobby as a volunteer. I was a volunteer from 2008 to 2013. I founded our 5th or our 6th chapter, and it's amazing what people will let you do when you don't ask to be paid. And I was able to review legislative text, provided opinions. I wrote several position papers for the organization, traveled to DC 5 times, and they let me get in front of congressional staff 75 times. And after this, they decided, maybe we should pay Danny. And they said, Danny, are you willing to move across the country away from your wife, from your friends, your family, and Southern California weather? And I said yes, I was willing to do that. And so they let me start the DC office. So I founded our presence in DC, and I've been here since. So here I am, the Vice President of Government Affairs. My roles at Citizens Climate Lobby include developing our political strategy and our written policy defense. I'm our chief lobby coach. I help develop relationships with NGOs. I'm an organizational liaison for researchers who do studies for us, and I provide expertise on technical topics to volunteers and to Congress. So now let's talk about Citizens Climate Lobby. We have both a 501c3 and a 501c4. CCL is the more popular one. That's the 501c4, but pretty much everybody is employed by CCE, the 501c3. I think of this as the staff of CCE, the volunteers, which are the most important part, are CCL. And this is a good summary slide of this organization. We have 2 goals: to create the political will for a livable world. And we recognize and put up front that creating something is hard. And so we have up front, we're asking all our volunteers to do something difficult. But then we also we want to empower our volunteers to experience breakthroughs in exercising their personal and political power. And I've always understood what is being broken through, both as a volunteer and later as staff, is comfort zones. You need to be uncomfortable to get things done. And so I see it as my job to make our volunteers uncomfortable, but to make sure that they have the tools, the resources, the support they need to push through that discomfort into empowerment. We have one policy, we're a bit unusual. This is passage of the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. Is a carbon price, is specifically a carbon fee. I'll be talking more about that later. We believe this to be the best first step, not the last step, but the first step to a livable world. We have one rule: if you can't express appreciation and respect for your elected officials, you can't call yourself CCL. So what this means is that for our Oklahoma volunteers, if they're going to talk with Senator James Inhofe, Senator Snowball, arch climate denier, if they can't find something that they genuinely appreciate and respect about his record, then they can't call themselves CCL. It's difficult for a lot of climate advocates. And how do we measure success when looking at our organization? Well, here's some highlights in 2020. We've gone from 5 or 6 chapters when I joined to 613 active chapters around the world. This year, we've had 861 meetings with members of Congress, 22% of which have been face-to-face. We're actually in the midst of our second big lobby day of the year this week, so that number will jump a bit. We got 69 co-sponsors on bills that we supported and we're asking for, not just the Energy Innovation Act, but for others after our June lobby day, which is the really big one. Already this week, we've heard of 3 new co-sponsors on the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act this week. We had 5,010 independent viewers on our Zoom line and on social media platforms for our plenary to the conference this Saturday. And as I said, HR 763, the Energy Innovation Carbon Dividend Act, that's the main focus. We're very proud. There are 10 carbon pricing bills before the United States Congress right now. But if you check the Lobbying Disclosure Act filings for Koch Industries, this is the only one that they list. So very proud to say that this is the one that Koch Industries sees as the biggest threat of this policy type. Why do economists like carbon taxes so much? Well, I'll just quote the economists here. And economists, of course, are focused on efficiency. It's important to understand this for understanding their lens on society. And they want to get, what they mean by efficiency is to the desired outcome at the lowest cost. And from a 2009 survey of economists, 97.9% of economists surveyed agreed or strongly agreed that placing a, quote, price on carbon through a tax or cap and trade system will increase incentives for energy efficiency and development of lower carbon energy production. So the take-home point from that is economists believe this is going to work. Here you have one from, this is a report from Columbia. This was actually a report on the bill, the HR 763. For decades, economists have recommended a price on carbon as an important element of a cost-effective strategy to address the risks of climate change. And this was actually uncited. It was remarkable that this is such a truism. So economists take this for granted so much that they didn't feel the need to cite this statement. And then here, Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan group of wonks who advised Congress in 2008, a tax on emissions would be the most efficient, and remember, efficiency to economists means getting the desired outcome at lowest cost, incentive-based option for reducing emissions, and could be relatively easy to implement. So that's another concern about any policy is you can pass it, but how easy is it to implement? Nonpartisan experts are saying this could be relatively easy to implement. And then here from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their special report on a 1.5-degree world, explicit carbon prices remain a necessary condition of ambitious climate policies. Some authors highlight the potential benefit brought by coordination among groups of countries. And here, the scientists who know the most about climate are saying that this is something that is necessary to get the job done. And one thing that I'm going to be highlighting in this presentation is I would love for you to be playing with this policy idea yourself. So I'm going to highlight 4 tools that are relatively easy to use that you can take and you can play around with this and get a sense for what this kind of policy can do and what it can't do. The first one is En-ROADS. And we wrote a blog about this, but if you play with En-ROADS, this is a global model, so not just the United States, everywhere. And it's very easy to use. Our volunteers love this, but it shows how you have sources of energy from 2000 to 2010, how they change, a lot of power to just change things as you like, and then how much they estimate that will reduce emissions. And here, this is as close as they could get to HR 763. This is basically the biggest single thing you can do to reduce emissions. And you'll notice it doesn't get to 2 degrees and definitely doesn't get to 1.5 degrees. Again, you'll need other policies, but this is the biggest single chunk. But this is a really neat tool to explore. And then another thing is, if it can't get the job done, what are some other options? This is another paper out of Columbia. That's the title, Interactions Between a Federal Carbon Tax and Other Climate Policies. This is a bit hard to read, so I've placed it out. What are the most complementary policies? What are the most redundant policies to a carbon price? And here, the least complementary is regulations of greenhouse gases covered by the carbon tax. And the most complementary, this one is unsurprising, regulations of greenhouse gases not covered by the carbon tax, regulations of local air pollutants, removing fossil fuel subsidies, energy efficiency standards and programs, funding innovation in low carbon technologies, and public infrastructure supporting low carbon transportation and land use. So for us as an organization that does support a carbon fee, we're most interested in these most complementary policies as a next best step. And so now let's get to those choices. As I said, I want to identify the 4 main points of decision and how you can tweak those and make decisions that work for you. So the basic design elements for a carbon fee or a carbon tax are, number 1, the initial price and the rate of increase. And this determines the emissions reductions. In the economic models that you see, it's just the price. They take the money and they use it in different ways, but that doesn't actually drive emissions. It's only the price. And so this is the only moving part that determines the emissions reductions. Second point is the revenue use. And this determines incidence, and I'll talk about this a little bit more. What they mean by incidence is how it affects different populations within the United States. Are you going to have a border carbon adjustment? You would do this to prevent leakage. Leakage in this case means companies relocating to more permissive countries and then polluting more and then exporting back. That's leakage. And then regulatory treatment. Not all carbon prices have any regulatory treatment. For economists, this is the opportunity to increase efficiency. I also think that this is the opportunity to make a deal, make a bipartisan deal. And if you are going to give something up in terms of regulations, I think there's also the opportunity to gain something in regulations. And so going back to the slide, I said the most complementary policies, and perhaps what is of most interest to this group, get some wins on regulation of local pollutants. I think there's room for a deal in there. And so what are some values that you might embody in a policy like this? If you value emissions reductions, you want to get the highest price as quickly as possible. If you want to take care of the poor, you can tweak how you use the revenue. If you want to grow GDP, you're going to make different decisions about how you use the revenue. If you want to enforce global participation, you're going to focus a lot on the border adjustment. Maybe you want to streamline government, and then you would focus more on the regulatory pause if that was included. And some people think that having an equal impact on everyone is important. Again, that's going to be in the revenue use. Here's another resource that you can use. This is from RFF, Resources for the Future. This is the website at the top. And this just shows, as I said, there are 10 carbon prices before Congress. This easy to use model enables you to compare several different ways in which several different policies and several different slices at them. And you can see this is just emissions reductions. In 10 years, you're talking about, for some of these policies, a 40% reduction in emissions. So that's another thing about these policies. They work pretty quickly. And then incidents, this is also really important. This is also from Resources for the Future. Economists talk about 3 primary ways of using the revenue: capital recycling, labor recycling, and a lump sum rebate. Capital recycling, this is tax cuts to businesses. And what you can see here, you have lowest income quintile on the left, highest income quintile on the right. This orange stuff is just the mean household, the average. So it's a proxy for GDP. Moving down is they're less well off financially. Moving up, they're better off. So capital recycling, only the wealthy benefit. Labor recycling, this is cutting payroll taxes. Everybody does kind of poorly. And a lump sum rebate, you see, this is extremely progressive. So you have the bottom 3 quintiles on average end up ahead. The top 2 quintiles end up the worst, and they're dragging down the mean household as a whole. But you have at least 60% of the population that is going to be doing better if you do a lump sum rebate or dividend. So now, speaking of dividends, let's talk about the Energy Innovation Carbon Dividend Act. The choices made in this policy on the price, $15 increasing by $10 per ton per year, so a pretty aggressive rate of increase, but a modest starting point. 100% dividend, full share per adult, half share per child. There is a border adjustment designed to be even-steven, neither punishing nor incentivizing businesses. And short-term pause on select greenhouse gas regulatory authority, not local pollutants, only greenhouse gases. And that the trade for that short-term pause is, I would argue, a long-term strengthening of the regulatory apparatus. And what happens when you do this, this is from a study that we did, and here again is another tool you can use. We have what's called a personal carbon dividend calculator, where you can put in your own statistics and you can find out, how would you do? Would you end up ahead in this policy? Or if there's constituents who you're concerned about, you can do that for them. But all households, as that, you can see the shape of this curve, very similar to what RFF said. All households, 61% benefit, and then this, it's 24%. ML is a minor loss, and that's defined as less than 0.2% of income loss. So overall 61%, but here you have the lowest income quintile by consumption, 96% benefit. 85% benefit in quintile 2, 68%. So this is a policy that's going to be really good, put a lot of money into the pockets of low-income Americans. And we also looked at different demographic groups in this study, and you can see the numbers there. For African Americans, 72% benefit outright. You can work on down. By contrast, white Americans, 54%. So this really does target economic. The way this is constructed, it really does target economic inequalities. And by doing so, it's also addressing some of the racial inequalities. But you could tweak this. This is the way this policy works out, but these policies you can customize them. So if you wanted to engage with this, you could tweak it and you could tweak these results. You certainly could do that. Last thing, I wanted to highlight this speed of implementation, and this is the last tool that you can use. This is from Energy Innovation. This is the think tank that did the study for the House Select Committee on the climate crisis. And these were the top 15 policies that had the biggest emissions reductions. What you're looking at here is avoided deaths. So lives saved. And because the carbon price is so easy to implement, the Energy Innovation Act would go into force in 9 months. And because it's only the carbon price that reduces emissions reductions, it goes into place quickly, and you see this big chunk of lives, avoided deaths, are due to the carbon tax. And so this is the last tool, and this, like En-ROADS, models a lot of different policies, not just a carbon price. So it's a useful tool. So just to conclude, economists and scientists agree that carbon prices work, and they work well. It is extremely exciting to see so many ambitious bipartisan bills out. HR 763 so far has gotten the most attention from Congress and from Koch Industries, but many ideas enable a robust discussion on what values should be reflected into law. And I hope we can get into that into the Q&A. And I also highlighted several easy to use tools that you can play with. And here they are. This is the personal carbon dividend calculator. That's En-ROADS. This is resources for the future. And here's the energy innovation model, which is a bit more complicated, but I hope this is useful to you. So I will stop sharing.
Great, thank you, Danny. And we will have opportunities to ask questions in the Q&A and discussion portion of this webinar. So the next up to speak is Dr. Nikki Sheets. The floor is yours.
Hi, Tina. I guess I have to, let me share the screen. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So Tina, thanks for asking me to talk. I debated. So I'm representing, I run a policy center, Thomas Edison State University's college, virtual college in New Jersey, and I'm also a member of New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance and a member of the EJ Leadership Forum on Climate Change. As a coincidence, Danny, my PhD is also in biogeochemistry, stable isotope biogeochemistry. So my PhD is actually in biological oceanography. Obviously, like Danny, doing something very different now. So look, Tina asked me to come in and talk about carbon pricing from an EJ perspective. And I debated on how to do this. I said, well, should I talk about carbon pricing, the basics of it, and then point out, you know, the problems that EJ communities have with it? And I think most of you probably know that the EJ community has by and large, you know, been against carbon trading and very, very suspicious of carbon tax, or at least a, you know, pure carbon tax with market-based mechanisms. And that's when I heard Tina say carbon price, and I thought of, you know, market-based climate change mitigation policy. And I ultimately decided, well, you know, I talk a lot about mandatory emissions reductions, climate change mitigation policy from EJ perspective, which is kind of a solution to some of the mitigation policies that we see, including market-based mechanisms from an EJ perspective. So I said, well, maybe I'll go ahead and give that presentation I always give. And then from that context, talk about some of the issues that a lot of EJ groups have with market-based mechanisms. And I'll be honest with you, I did that for several reasons. One is because I have the PowerPoint already prepared, right? But another is because often as EJ people, we're accused of just saying no and not having solutions. And I don't think that's true. I think we have solutions, but people just don't like them and ignore them a lot of times. But I thought, well, let's go from the solution and one of the solutions, one of the policies that we are proposing, and then we can use that as a context to talk more broadly about market-based mechanisms. So let's try that. So let's start out with a figure that I show a lot, so much so some of you may have seen it. Tina has seen it multiple times at this point. I've been teased that I show it so much, but I think I have a pretty new audience here when I can gather. So I'm excited about that. So this is a figure created by New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection in 2009. And it shows the relationship between cumulative impacts, race, and income in New Jersey. And for these purposes, our purposes today, you can think of cumulative impacts as a very rough estimate of the total amount of pollution in a neighborhood. If you want a more formal definition later, ask me and I can give it to you. So New Jersey DEP, the first thing they did was they estimated the amount of cumulative impacts in every neighborhood in New Jersey. And then they asked the question, well, what's the relationship between race and income and cumulative impacts, this estimate of total amount of pollution in New Jersey. And so they graphed it. And one thing I want to say, again, this is coming from New Jersey DEP, not us crazy EJ folk in New Jersey, right? And look at the result of the graph. Look at the top figure. You see that as the number of people of color in New Jersey increases, or in a New Jersey neighborhood increases, so is the amount of cumulative impacts. And the same for poverty. If you look at the bottom graph, as the number of people living in poverty in a New Jersey neighborhood increases, so is the amount of cumulative impacts. Right? They're almost straight line relationships. So I'll say what I have said a lot of times before, many times before. What these figures are providing you evidence of is that if you live in New Jersey, the amount of pollution in your neighborhood is connected to race and income. The amount of money in your pocket and the color of your skin. And this goes against everything that at least we claim we stand for in the state and in the country. And, you know, obviously to worry about the disproportionate amount of pollution you see on the right in EJ neighborhoods. When I say EJ neighborhoods, I'm talking about communities of color, low-income neighborhoods. Just for reference, these neighborhoods aren't labeled on the figures, but Newark, the largest city in New Jersey, is about 88% of color. So you see it would fall way on the right of your top figure. You know, the reason that we are so worried about the disproportionate amount of pollution in neighborhoods is because we believe, and there's evidence of, that it's connected to bad health outcomes. And we all know about the health disparities that exist based on race and income in the United States. And we're worried that this is feeding into it, right? And at its core, I will argue to you that this is why many of us are in the environmental justice movement. And the core of our worries are public health problems in our communities related to pollution. Now, of course, we have, you know, EJ is broader than that, right? We talk about transportation equity. We talk about food equity. So, you know, we have a lot of areas, climate equity, right? Climate justice, food justice, transportation justice. But at the core, I would argue to you, is this worry about public health. And so one thing we have come to say is that we have to develop strategies to address this disproportionate amount of pollution, this estimated disproportionate amount of pollution that you see in our neighborhoods in New Jersey. And it's going to take a number of policies to address it. Some of those policies will address cumulative impacts directly, you know, through the concept of cumulative impacts. And we just got a major new bill passed in New Jersey in late August that does that. But other policies are going to address pieces of this disproportionate amount of pollution you see. And what we're advocating is that climate change mitigation policy be used not only to fight climate change, but to address a disproportionate amount of pollution in our neighborhoods. And I should say before I leave these figures that this is not just New Jersey, right? You don't find this relationship only in New Jersey. Part of what started the EJ movement in the late 1980s were national investigations reports that show similar type of relationships. So let's talk about climate change mitigation policy from an EJ perspective. here's my initial premise. Climate change mitigation policy should produce emissions reductions for EJ communities. That's one of the things we want from climate change mitigation policy from an environmental justice perspective. We also want to fight climate change, and you normally do that. Well, you do that by reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, most commonly carbon dioxide. But we also wanted to deliver emissions reductions in EJ communities. Here's a more detailed premise. Look at that top paragraph. And this is the guts of the presentation, at least the part about, the mandatory emissions reductions. And so let's pull it apart. So that paragraph says, what we want from climate change mitigation policy from the EJ perspective are guaranteed emissions reductions in and near EJ communities, preferably with greenhouse gas co-pollutant reductions intentionally maximized, but reductions either way. So what's that mean? Well, guaranteed emissions reductions in and near EJ communities. So we know what an EJ community is, communities of color, low-income communities. But why are we talking about guaranteed emissions reductions in the context of climate change mitigation policy? Because isn't it all about getting emissions reductions? Yes, but as we'll talk about, not all climate change mitigation policies guarantee emissions reductions in EJ communities. And from an EJ perspective, that's a problem. So that's what we want. We want those guaranteed emissions reductions, preferably with greenhouse gas co-pollutant reductions intentionally maximized. So what does that mean? Let's talk about what a greenhouse gas co-pollutant is. Greenhouse gas, right, carbon dioxide. But a lot of times, and in this case, we develop these policies primarily thinking about power plants. Power plants will emit greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, but at the same time, they emit these other air pollutants along with the greenhouse gases. So if you're talking about it from a climate change mitigation perspective, these other air pollutants are called greenhouse gas co-pollutants. Now, greenhouse gases are thought not to have a detrimental local impact. So the carbon dioxide is being emitted, doesn't harm you directly. It starts to harm you by causing climate change, and climate change harms you. But these other co-pollutants, like particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, hazardous air pollutants, they cause death and illness directly. And so from an EJ perspective, we want to reduce emissions of these co-pollutants to improve the health of our communities. Right? And these co-pollutants make up part of the disproportionate amount of pollution that the figures showed in the neighborhoods in New Jersey. So from an EJ perspective, again, what we would want from a climate change mitigation policy is that it be intentionally developed, not only to achieve a carbon dioxide reduction goal, whether that's 10% or 15% or 50%. We want strategies that would meet that carbon dioxide reduction goal, but at the same time, maximize the reduction of these locally harmful co-pollutants. Right? But no climate change strategy that we've come across does that. Doesn't intentionally maximize co-pollutant reduction. So what we say is that we'll take the next best thing, and we'll take carbon dioxide, guaranteed carbon dioxide reductions in EJ communities, because we're going to get some incidental reduction of these co-pollutants. Right? You won't get as much co-pollutant reduction as you would if the policy was intentionally developed to maximize that. But we'll get some, and we will take what we can get. A little bit more on co-pollutants. The one we worry about the most is fine particulate matter. Fine refers to the size of the particle. It's also called PM 2.5. That means it's small enough to get into your lungs, and there it starts to wreak havoc. And it's deadly. 2007 study from MIT, I need to update my studies, estimated that it caused 200,000 premature deaths in the country alone, just as fine particulate matter air pollution. And there are other air pollutants we worry about, like the oxides, nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxide, and hazardous air pollutants. So we're viewing climate change mitigation policy as a chance not only to fight climate change, but and this is a key, but to be used in conjunction with existing policies aimed at these co-pollutants, because there are already policies aimed at reducing concentrations and emissions of fine particulate matter and nitrogen oxides and hazardous air pollutants. But we want to use climate change policy on top of that existing policy, right? We want to integrate into climate change mitigation policies mechanisms that will help to lower concentrations and emissions of these locally harmful co-pollutants. And we think that if we use climate change mitigation policy in this way, in conjunction with existing policies that are already in place to fight these co-pollutants, we will be able to achieve reductions in these co-pollutants that we have not been able to achieve by using the existing policies that are already in place. And we need to lower the concentration of these pollutants. Now, look, there are, as I said, existing statutes, regulations already set a national standard for, say, fine particulate matter. But it's important for you to know that even if your state or your area is meeting this standard for fine particulate matter, it is still killing people and making people sick. And that's especially true when you take into account in EJ communities, you have these multiple sources of pollution. Right? You have this cumulative pollution impact that makes everything worse. Right? So what the science is telling us, for example, about particulate matter air pollution is that there's no lower threshold that we can drive down concentrations of particulate matter below which you won't get health benefits. I'll say that in English. Basically, the lower the concentration of this air pollutant, the better. And here's a slide just saying, look, we need to use climate change mitigation policy and other policy to help existing policies in EJ communities to fight air pollution. Because even with those existing policies, we're finding that folks in our communities are more exposed to air pollution than folks in other communities. Right? So air pollution is an EJ issue already. So look, from our perspective, we think this is pretty straightforward from EJ perspective, right? We're saying, well, let's use climate change mitigation policy to help address this disproportionate pollution in our communities. And climate change mitigation policy is all about emissions reductions anyway, right? So what's the problem? Well, part of the problem is that market-based mechanisms don't guarantee emissions reductions in EJ communities, right? You heard Danny talk about complementary policies to help this, but what we're saying is that, yeah, those complementary policies, or those policies to address these air pollutants, there are some, they are already out there, right? But we need to also integrate something into climate change mitigation policy that guarantees these reductions in EJ communities. And market-based mechanisms, carbon trading or a carbon tax doesn't do that. It doesn't guarantee emissions reduction in EJ communities. Those decisions are made by the market, right? So in a way, when you're defining equity in EJ as emissions reductions, it leaves it to chance, or it leaves it, these mechanisms leaves it to the market to decide. And we don't agree with that. Let me be careful. What I'm not saying is that under a market-based mechanism, you will never get emissions reductions in EJ communities. That's not true. Three things can happen. Emissions can increase under a market-based mechanism in EJ communities. They can stay the same, or they can be reduced. Now, you undoubtedly will get some reductions from market-based mechanisms in EJ communities. But the question is, how many EJ communities will get these reductions? What will be the extent of these reductions? Which communities will get these reductions? Over what time scale when they occur? Because remember, the market-based mechanisms don't guarantee emissions reductions at any particular facility. So we've come up with a fairly straightforward solution to the question of how do you use climate change mitigation policy to address disproportionate pollution in EJ communities. We're saying we locate those plants. Now we talk about power plant sector, located in EJ communities or whose emissions significantly impact EJ communities, and force them to reduce. And don't give them, see if I can, there you go. Now I'll talk a little bit more about this, about the market-based mechanism. Don't give them the option to keep on polluting, no matter what your climate change mitigation policy is. And we know implementation, though, we're going to have to give it more thought, because how do you define EJ community? I've said communities of color, low-income communities, but we need a more specific definition. How much do we want to reduce by? Those questions we will, we have to figure out. This just reiterates some of the points I made before. Climate change mitigation policy should yield reductions above and beyond those reductions that we're currently getting under the Clean Air Act, under those policies that are now directed specifically at what I'm calling greenhouse gas coal pollutants. And due to high levels of cumulative impacts, here's the phrase we've coined, we're going to need cumulative policies to address cumulative impacts. And the policies we're currently using to address these coal pollutants, because of cumulative impacts, partly, and because how bad these air pollutants can be on their own, it's just not satisfactory. We need more. So let's take a little bit of a step back. What I'm saying in general is that environmental justice and equity should be part of climate change mitigation policy. It should not, EJ and equity should not be left to chance or addressed later. And the market should not make our environmental justice and equity decisions for us. And we're talking about emissions reductions here. Emissions reductions should be planned and intentional. So they should be decided by policymakers and by communities, not by the market. Now, here's where I usually leave off the presentation and I issue a challenge. I say, look, we hear from a lot of people, a lot of groups, that EJ is a priority for them. And if that's so, I issue a challenge and I say, well, if that is true, if environmental justice is a priority, then make getting emissions reductions for EJ communities as important as obtaining greenhouse gas reductions, right? We want to save the world, but we want to make sure that the folks in our communities are alive when the world is saved. And the little girl you see there, I love that picture, is a member of the environmental justice community. Now, let me say though, let me give you a little bit more thoughts about market-based mechanisms. And I won't go, here's a slide I can use later on if you want to get into more details about how under carbon trading system, you could actually get more pollution in EJ communities. Although I gotta say, what we emphasize here, getting more pollution from a market-based mechanism is the worst case scenario. What we really want to do is ensure that whatever type of climate change policy is being used, that it guarantees emissions reductions in EJ communities. We really want the reductions. So under carbon trading, you have to get a permit or an allowance before you can emit carbon. And the worry is that companies will, buy allowances and keep on polluting, perhaps at the same level they are now, or God forbid at a higher level. And under a carbon tax mechanism, you worry that if the tax is not high enough, that they will keep polluting and just pay the tax and keep polluting, especially in EJ communities where you might have older plants and the cost of reducing carbon may be higher than in other areas. So here are some thoughts that I usually don't talk about, but let me just add on to them since we're talking about carbon pricing. And I want to note that, look, I have very carefully not gotten into the debate about whether market-based mechanisms overall reduce emissions of carbon dioxide. But I will tell you, there's a debate there. I appreciate Dan's slides and him saying, well, there's basically kind of saying there's a consensus among scientists and economists. I will just say, I don't think the consensus is as strong or as wide as Dan might believe they are. But, you know, I don't go into those areas. I don't read all the stuff there, although I did just read an article today saying that. So I don't generally get into those arguments. You know, I talk about the environmental justice part of this. So let me give you some thoughts from an environmental justice perspective. So the first bullet point you see there is, do we want a society where we emphasize cost over justice and equity? And mention the grid, that's a reminder to myself. So, and I think as Dan talked about, Derek to a lesser degree, but you know, the whole idea of the market-based mechanisms is to deliver the same reductions to you that you can get from regulations. And by the way, I haven't said it explicitly, at least in New Jersey, what we favor is a regulatory system over a market-based system. People call it pejoratively command and control, right? That's what we favor, just like the Clean Air Act does for other air pollutants. So the whole idea of emissions trading, though, and I'm old enough to remember when the idea was kind of, you know, first being floated, or at least widely talked about. When I was young, I was actually an economics major. And it really does emphasize the cost, the efficiency. And in its purest form, and I'm glad the Climate Lobby and Derek and EDF are both talking about, well, if you want to do, you know, get equity and some justice there, you can do this and do that, you know. But in its pure form anyway, it doesn't talk about equity and justice, right? And I'm just, let me just say this, is that where we want our society to be, where such an important environmental policy really emphasizes the cost? I mean, it talks about the reductions, but then the next thing it talks about really are the cost, and not as much about equity and justice. Right? It really talks about equity and justice more as a constraint, right? That, well, one of our goals is we want to get the reductions. Our other goal is to do it at the lowest cost. Yeah, and we're going to pay attention to the equity and justice. You know, Dan talked about complementary policy. But for us, I think we want something at the core that wrestles with justice and equity. And say, I mentioned the grid as an example, and I get blank stares from a lot of people when I say this. You know, the electricity grid, right, that decides which power plants come online to meet the demand for electricity. What is the criteria it uses, by and large, to decide which plant comes online? Well, it uses cost. I think to a much, much lesser degree, it uses environmental concerns, but, you know, to a much, much less degree, it basically runs off of cost and does not consider justice and equity in all. And as a society, I just don't think that's where we want to be, especially with the current emphasis on racial and social justice. Right here, we have a moment where, oh, sorry, I forgot to unplug my other phone. Here we have a moment where, at least if you don't support Trump, right, we are really trying to find ways to move forward racial and social justice. And market-based mechanisms, again, at their core, right, don't do that. So I would argue to you that, given that, at best they're tone deaf to racial and social justice. Right? That's not their intent. That's not where they are. And for us, I think that's where we want to be. And since we have an opportunity, hopefully, we need to act on that. My third bullet point is EJN equity should not be left to chance or addressed later. I said that earlier. Let me just talk about this in the context of funding, because, you know, this has been an argument going on for a long time about carbon trading in particular, that, well, we'll use the money generated by carbon trading or carbon tax, and we'll address these emissions reduction concerns and equity concerns with the money. But so far, and actually, Derek, I appreciate your email to me about this, that other people are thinking about this. But so far, how that has come across to us many times is that we're going to address equity and justice now. We're going to address carbon reduction now, and we're going to leave EJ and equity to be addressed later through the money. And that's the way it certainly has come to us in New Jersey, where we are part, as are 10 northeastern states, of a carbon trading system called RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. The EJ community objected to New Jersey going into that, and New Jersey went into it over our objections. Actually, we were in it under a Democratic governor. We were pulled out of it by a conservative Republican governor, and our more progressive Democratic governors put us back in over the objections of the EJ community. Okay? And what they are saying to us is that, well, we'll use the money to address the, emissions reductions concern you were talking about. But the problem is, we are in the carbon trading system now, have been in it for several years, back in it for several years, and those policies have not been developed yet. We don't know exactly what those policies will be. We don't know how much investment will be made in those policies. We don't know what the reductions will be, the amount of the reductions. We don't know which communities will receive those reductions. We don't know over what time those reductions will occur. So there's a lot we don't know about the promise of addressing EJ and equity with the money, but we do know the carbon trading system's going forward. And to us, that's just not good enough. And look, we are walking a fine line. I will just say this, because I'm talking about New Jersey now, we have suggested this mandatory emission reduction policy in New Jersey. So far, we have not gotten anywhere with it. And why I say we're walking a fine line is because we are trying not to give the impression that, and as I said, we favor a regulatory system, that even if this was integrated into the way the RGGI rule operates in New Jersey, which is what we've asked for so far, we don't want to give the impression that then we will be all right with market mechanisms. Right? We don't want to give the impression that we will endorse market mechanisms if you integrate this into the market-based mechanism. What we have said is that, look, if you're going to do this carbon trading over our objections, at least make it more palatable to EJ communities by incorporating this policy suggestion into it. Part of the reasons why, we don't want to just give the impression that we will endorse market mechanisms if you integrate this policy. We'll say, hey, that's better. But to some extent, we want to hold the line in New Jersey. And we've been told this by some of our colleagues in other parts of the country, because, they are worried that carbon trading will come, for example, or market-based mechanisms will come to the Midwest, right? We have a carbon trading system in California. Our colleagues in Chicago, Minneapolis say, hey, we hear various times that something may happen here. So what we do in New Jersey, we don't want to impact what happens, in the Midwest, other areas of the country. Now, having said that, look, I'm pointing out to you issues with market-based mechanisms. EJ is very local. If you have an EJ organization locally that says, hey, we hear what you're saying, Sheets, but we got it, right? We got the mechanism to take this money or whatever and use it in a way that we're comfortable with, or, mechanisms to address emissions reductions. I hear you, and EJ's local, go to it. But, in this discussion about carbon pricing, we want to point out the issues that the EJ community has had with market-based mechanisms and still have, and that need to be addressed, and point out to some extent what we're doing in New Jersey. I feel like I'm missing something, but this is my last slide. And I just want to point out this. And Derek, I really appreciate what you were saying. When you were talking, Derek, you were saying, hey, basically almost what I'm saying here, that we need to integrate these concerns into market-based mechanisms. And I will say that Derek referred to a federal rule that came out some years ago. I think Derek was referring to the Clean Power Plan. And we did a lot of work, I and several other colleagues, 2-3 other colleagues, Jelon White Newsom, who was heading up the EJ Leadership Forum on Climate Change, being one of them, Cecilia Martinez being another. We did a lot of work on the Clean Power Plan. It was a carbon trading system that at least when it first came to us, did not integrate any EJ into it, and still did not, even after they responded to some of our comments and our criticism, our critique, did not integrate mandatory EJ considerations or programs or mechanisms into it. So, from EJ perspective, was problematic, has some very large questions about it. So now we have another initiative, and that was addressing power plants. We have another initiative being proposed, the Transportation and Climate Initiative, that is being proposed to address greenhouse gases from mobile sources, right? Diesel powered vehicles, trucks, buses, and cars. And we agree that EJ community agrees that this is definitely needed. So what's the issue? Well, guess what's at its core? A carbon trading system. And they're proposing to address that, does not address equity and justice, or does not, guarantee emissions reductions in EJ communities. And I guess as part of the recognition of that, they're saying, well, we're going to address the equity and justice through complementary policies. Right. Now, these complementary policies have not been fully developed yet. So, it really drives us a little crazy, because they spent about 10 years on modeling and discussions and come up with the carbon trading system, but not with policies to address equity and justice. And in any case, we don't think justice should be relegated to complementary status. Right? It's got to be at the core, or it doesn't have to be. We think it should be at the core. Right? We think that climate change mitigation, no matter whether market-based, regulatory-based, whatever, at the core of the policy should be, at the core of the program should be policies that not only get greenhouse gas emissions reductions, but also address justice and equity, again, as a core policy. So the TCI, Transportation and Climate Initiative, is being proposed for the Northeast again. It's sometimes called a RGGI on wheels. And Northeast EJ organizations have come out against it. And we developed a national letter from groups that are also, EJ groups that are also in the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform. It's not a letter from the platform, but from the EJ groups in it, that to say we oppose TCI, we oppose the Transportation and Climate Initiative, because the Climate Justice Alliance has come out with a letter previously. And we want everybody to know the EJ groups are together in the opposition. And we would invite your groups, and I think Tina and Corinne could get the letter to you, to sign on to this letter. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to go unplug my other phone so it won't ring anymore while we take questions and answers. But thanks for the opportunity to present. And Tina, I'm going to turn the screen back over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Sheets. I'm going to pin our panelists so we can see them. So this was really, in this series, I found it super impressive how much I learn, even though I work with Danny in some capacity or another, and have seen Dr. Sheets' presentation and have talked to Derek about different things, that there's always these different nuances around the work that folks that are engaging in policy issues bring to the table. So I just want to thank you all for just sharing your insights and your perspectives with us today. I want to open it up to participants on the call to, on the webinar, to ask questions. You can raise your hand, or you can just start talking. And if it's a problem, then I will insist that you raise your hand. So I'm going to give it a second and see if there's any initial questions before I ask a question.
Very good, guys. Dr. Sheets, Joe Womack here. One of my fears years ago when I first learned that the EJ movement was going to sort of be merged with climate change, but the EJ movement was going to get lost, and but it has not. But I think it's not lost primarily because of the racial justice movement. What do you think about that?
I think several things, Joe. I think for years we've had this stance around, around market-based mechanisms, in particular around carbon trading. I mean, we formed the EJ Leadership Forum, right, in part and largely in response to carbon trading that was being proposed back in 2007, 2008. And we have a more complicated history of carbon tax, which we can, I may be the only one, I'm looking at, I may be the only kind of original member of the Leadership Forum that remembers those debates. But, we were very clear that public health had to be, and equity and justice had to be part of the climate change equation. And people got mad at us. I mean, the division between the green groups and EJ groups was real and bitter. And we were punished by funders because they were backing the market-based mechanisms. And so we had a hard time getting money because of that, but we stood our ground. And I think, and maybe, everybody always thinks they're what success has, what they call it? Everyone's the mother of success, but anyway, I think in a large part of the reason we're now talking about justice and equity in climate change policy is because of the stance the EJ community took. And not many people were behind us then, Joe. We were out there alone. We were on an island. There were a few, but we were really out there. And slowly, though, over the years, people have said, well, maybe they're not that crazy. And other people have said, yeah, this is a real issue. How are we going to address it? And I think, though, Black Lives Matter, I think really gives us even more of an opportunity to come to grips with this. I think over the last 5 years, EJ has really become like, everybody and their mother and father want to do EJ. Now, I think the Black Lives Matter movement has actually accelerated that. So I think we have even a better opportunity now because, I think we helped create the opportunity before, and we have even a better opportunity now.
Monique, you had your hand raised.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you all presenters. Nikki, great job. I think one thing that might be helpful in terms of, figuring out a direction to go in is understanding how we got here and being really clear about that history and looking at just, on December 31st, it will be the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Clean Air Act into law. And those 50 years have been one that have just, the law is fundamentally based on market forces. And so we're talking about this cap and trade and, should it be based on market? Should it go with an equity? We got to really understand that our whole construct for the environmental regulatory system is market driven. And Nikki, I think I would reinforce your statements around public health, which is really about a basic human right to health that's denied by these environmental laws that okay and make lawful the harm that's happening to communities, Black communities in particular, and other communities of color around the country. And so how does that market drive work? If you boil down the Clean Air Act to its essence, which is the permit, and looking at just industrial sources for a moment, there's also mobile sources governed under this act, but just looking at industrial sources, Congress wrote into the, like for example, with hazardous air pollutants, benzene, toluene, all of those co-pollutants Nikki was getting into, as well as criteria pollutants, the fine particulate airborne particulates, PM 2.5 and others. they all look to and defer to industrial companies to set the standards based on the status quo of their operations. And so getting our hands and arms around that concept for environmental regulation, I think, is extremely important to make clear to folks so that we can talk about where do we go forward. A lot of people are under the misconception that there's something that needs to be enforced that's not being enforced in the Clean Air Act, as though the law, the title of the law dictates its outcome, and that's not the case. One thing I would love to offer to you, Tina, and NBEJN members is just a tutorial about what the Clean Air Act is and how it actually creates barriers to environmental justice and greenhouse gas emission reductions.
Thank you, Monique. That would be great. And there wasn't a question mark at the end, but definitely for the panelists, if there's a response or a reaction or a comment that you would like to share, that would be welcome.
Well, I think, thank you for the comments, Monique. And I think one of the mistakes that I know that EDF has made over the years is the shorthand of presuming that existing regulatory structures are strong, sufficient, acceptable, inclusive structures. And so that what you said really resonates with me. As we think about, as my colleagues who are attorneys, which I'm not, nor do I have a PhD in anything, regrettably, I think about one of the challenges to relying on the regulatory system is the state of the judiciary now. And so I think that makes it even more important, not only to make sure that we are doing as much as we can to strengthen the regulatory process, but also get things into statute in states and get things into statute where we can through congressional action. And I'm certainly hopeful that a future Congress that is more aligned with the values that I think most of the folks here hold would be in a position to establish an overarching framework like EJ for All or the Climate Equity Act as a governing paradigm for climate policy.
I'll just say quickly, I think from both what Derek and Monique was saying, that that's one reason why we're advocating the climate change mitigation policy be used in addition to the policies that are already there, because more is needed.
This is Beverly.
I'm sorry, can I just chime in? What I'm suggesting is that we really need to collectively reform what we have right now for environmental regulation. And I think because we're in this, it gives us this trick bag where we're talking about climate in terms of market, not in terms of health and future, is something that is driven by the way in which the law and how people have come to know its effect. This debate that we're having now, imagine if we had laws that actually guaranteed everyone the right to a healthy environment. Climate changes and the crisis we have now wouldn't have happened. I mean, we've had 50 years of a law that has been making legal the pollution that only causes nosebleeds and respiratory damage, reproductive damage, and cancers in communities that are in the shadows of the polluting facilities, but it's also warming the planet. And that's, I think, if we're really going to make, I think, any advances or progress, both are rooted in the same place, which is, I think, the brilliance of what you've done, Nikki, around co-pollutants and greenhouse gas emissions. And I would just suggest going further in terms of looking at the root cause for what makes that pollution possible and actually protects it. And that's the law we've really got to think about changing.
Yep. I want to pull Danny in before I get to you, Dr. Ryan. And I'm just curious, Danny, from just this idea that the suggestion that's being made by Monique around reforming the environmental regulations and in the context of how CCL works through legislation and this, I mean, how do you see that kind of reforming impacting the type of legislation that you all push forward?
Yeah, and I think specifically what Monique is suggesting, I think she makes a compelling case. I mean, 50 years is it's a long time, and so I think that there's a lot has changed. Another thing from CCL's perspective, and we spend a lot of time working with both Democrats and Republicans, and I think it's a compelling case. I think it's also a huge lift to do the work. She's talking about a paradigm shift. And I think the paradigm shifts are worthy. I think we need a lot of paradigm shifted. I also don't think we serve ourselves well by downplaying the difficulty of that. So I find it compelling. I think the logic is sound. It also sounds like a big job.
Yeah. I would just add before. I think that's the crux of what Nikki was saying as well, though, is that we're in a moment now where that paradigm shift, that heavy lift, is what's being required for us to dismantle systemic racism and to transform the way the systems work currently. So that's a big point. Dr. Wright, the floor is yours.
Yes, good evening, everyone. I'm actually driving, but Nikki, I just wanted to say that I am also one of those people who remember those fights. And also inside of our own organization, it almost tore it apart as well. Dealing with carbon trading issues. But what Monique just presented is something that she's educated me on, and everywhere I go, I talk about now that I understand why it is, although we've been fighting for 30 years to make the Mississippi River Chemical Corridor safe for people who live there, why we've lost cases and why it's not possible. And it really goes back to the Clean Air Act. And whenever I hear people, this is a big lift, but so was slavery, so was the integration of schools. There's nothing that really makes a difference that is easy, but you have to start someplace. In thinking about carbon trading versus regulations, we've had regulations and it hasn't protected us. And that's what a lot of people are, when they think about carbon trading and all these things, and you look at, well, is this or regulations? Regulations have been in place, but politically they've not been enforced, and they've been enforced differently depending upon where you live. And, we live in the deep South. We live in red states. So having a regulation on the book means nothing. It's about getting the people and having the political will to enforce it. So, it's for me, it's a trap either way we go. And we have to be concerned about, somehow dealing with the politics of it. That is what makes this so difficult. But so when we talk about carbon trading versus regulations, really, carbon trading, I'm not for that, and I'm not for regulations. There needs to be something a little bit different where it's combined, and I think that's what Nikki is trying to say. Whatever we do, whatever we move forward on, we need to make certain that communities are protected. And I don't know how we just focus on that part, keeping that in the forefront of everything, but we need to have a huge movement that begins looking at the Clean Air Act and where it has failed and begin to point out how it's failed. The Mississippi River Chemical Corridor is a case study of the failure of the Clean Air Act. So, I've enjoyed this presentation, and we need to start having more discussions regionally, because as Nikki says, EJ is local, and it really is. And what looks right for New Jersey and Louisiana kind of looks alike, except politically, I think we're different. But what looks right in one area could be very different in another. And we need to start having deep discussions within our communities so we could think about what a national policy should be, at the same time looking at how on the ground, where we live, looking at the political realities of where we are, what we need to do to make our communities safe. So this is a conversation that needs to continue. And also, Nikki, I love the way you're galvanizing people around New Jersey, but we also need people galvanized around with letters for Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, the former slave states, big time. We need that going on where we are as well.
Yeah, big time. Yeah.
Big time.
And you know,
yeah,
Bev, I think one of the missing links in the regulations and laws now, you know, when I start with cumulative impacts, is that, you know, one of the big problems why the regulations don't work as they should is because we're not considering the cumulative impacts, right? We do the regulations pollutant by pollutant, and we're not taking into account the cumulative burden, and we don't have a way of dealing with that. And yeah, the climate change mitigation policy that I'm suggesting would just be one other strategy to help address that. But we really got to come to grips with the cumulative impacts.
Well,
Question, and this is just going on off of the last speaker. Is there a possibility to get something like redistricting laws that have, you know, made sure that southern states and, you know, states like Texas, Louisiana, Gulf Coast have to submit state implementation plans over to be approved by the Fed and implement that in some kind of Clean Air Act structure?
Well, I've had some experience with that, state implementation plans, and you know, we would back at one point, the only folks that filed written comments was the New Jersey EJ Alliance in New Jersey, but I got to say they you know, at that time they basically ignored them, because one remedy would be that you can defund states that are not in compliance, but I don't know if that's ever been used, and you know, so. On the books is a good remedy, but when you really try it, it takes a lot of time. I mean, I think that was part of us getting our cumulative impacts legislation, that we kept at it, but boy, it can be very frustrating.
We have a question from Dr. Keyes.
I think I want to say that I was as well, like Dr. Wright stated, around with Nikki and Cecil. Let's go here, We Act, specifically dealing with all of the carbon trading and taxes and all of this. And what is amazing to me is, as Dr. Wright stated, here we are 30 years later, still discussing pretty much dealing with lack of enforcement with all of the policies that exist on the book. And our health has not been the number one priority. And as I'm looking at COVID, let me say this, I call it the plandemic. Everything that is happening is pre-designed. There's no accident. And then with a lot of different financial calls and stuff I've been on, even in the ministry, I've been listening to folk talk about, you know, our communities being the target community for everything that relates to destruction and health, poverty, race, and economic injustices of everything plays a vital role in all that is happening with the carbon tax, the environmental climate injustices of things going on. And I don't know what it's going to take for a lot of changes, but I know that the environmental climate justice movement has been moving for a number of years. We're trying to get, let me just go here, and I'm just going to be blunt as possible, to get a lot of the white male leadership that is in authority, dealing with a lot of the resources, of trying to get resources put in the right place on the ground to deal with a lot of problem solving. And until the leadership that is in control of the money is willing to do the necessary thing that it would take to enhance and empower our communities, nothing changes. The money has to go on the ground to effect real changes. And this is where we are, because you're dealing with money and lack of enforcement. And until folks is ready to really discuss wealth empowerment. And when I speak of wealth, I'm talking about all of it, the holistic approach to what it takes to dealing with problem solving. And that's what it's going to take. We have the brains to do a lot of things, but we don't have access to the capital to make it happen. And I'm all game for whatever the ECJ movement is doing in support of policy changing, wealth enhancement, empowerment, whatever it is that's needed. But we know that we have been here for a while, and we know that there has to be a way to get resources on the ground to effect these kind of changes that's needed. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Keyes. I think one of the things that's a recurring theme that I'm hearing right now, and it's just about the, and it's in a different context, but it's about reforming the current processes and the current way in which regulation is being meted out. And I have a question actually, and I think this is directed to you, Derek, specifically because you spoke about hybrid policy or hybrid approach, a combination. And I think it sort of goes into a bit of sort of a combination of what each of you all were sharing. Can you talk a little bit about what that would be? What would a hybrid policy approach look like from EDF's perspective, or even from your, if you had control over everything and you could make the decision, what would it actually consist of, and what would be the effects of that hybrid approach?
It's a great question, and before I answer, I just want to say when I hear, Dr. Wright and Reverend Keyes and others talking, it really reminds me that when we think about the work that we do, any organization in this space thinks about the work that we do, we have to be mindful that we're dealing with a system that has nothing to do with, climate change is the impact of the system. And I really I shouldn't say because it's a scary concept, but I think what you said, Reverend Keyes, about plandemic and the intentionality of the design of our current systems is something we can never forget, especially organizations that have not centered justice in their history. And so I want to call that out. Hybrid may not be a great word for it. I actually think that Dr. Sheets, the paradigm he was laying out in his presentation, feels to me like the kind of outcome that we want, which is regardless of what policy approach you're taking, whether it's a renewable standard or whether it's a large COVID relief package, or whether it's a incentive to build and transmission lines so that certain kinds of energy can be more available. I think all of those policy types need to be infused with an understanding of the disproportionate impacts of the policy itself, but also an understanding of the ground on which that policy is going to land. So it's one thing to say, let's make the future better. But I think where policymaking and advocates like EDF have failed in the past is not to understand, communicate, and prioritize the amelioration of past harm as part of the policy approach that we support. I'll just say that the final thing that I carry with me in this regard, that I think is at this point an untested hypothesis, but it's a hypothesis that I have, which is that a market-based measure can be designed in a way that reduces the pollution burden and improves the health of all people, especially people in communities that have suffered and are on the front lines. So I guess my hypothesis is that you can have both, which is not to say that it's the best way to have both. It's just to say that you can, because I think, this is, I would say this is a personal view, a strong personal view, and a emerging organizational view that we shouldn't support policies that exacerbate local pollution. We just shouldn't. It shouldn't even be on the table. And I really appreciated the way that you crystallized those values in your presentation, Dr. Sheets. I found myself nodding so much that I had to go on, stop the video for a while so it wouldn't be distracting. But anyway, that's kind of how I think about hybrid policy, however you want to term it.
Yeah, Danny and both Dr. Sheets, I can see you both. And so go ahead, Danny, go right ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I had the good fortune of seeing Dr. Sheets present something a similar presentation that with similar clarity. And after that presentation, I was chewing on this. What might you do? How might you do this? And as I think I said, tried to make the point in my presentation, I think that it's if you're working with a carbon fee or tax, it's in the regulatory consideration, which interestingly is also where you get Republicans on, or where you at least have the potential of getting some Republicans on. So I want to float this idea. I mean, what if you just have regulations that say no individual facility can emit more than 90% of what it emitted in start date by this date, and then you just have this declining cap, because I mean the goal here is to get to zero emissions, right? I think that everybody on this call shares that goal. We don't want to be emitting any greenhouse gases. We don't want to be emitting any particulates. And so I think you can have that discussion and start talking about what would that look like, where paired with this carbon fee or carbon tax, you also have this mandate that each facility that is emitting stuff decreases everywhere over time with this. So so that's an idea that I'd love to hear Dr. Sheets respond to, because it seems
well,
like...
Before you respond to Dr. Sheets, I have a question for you, Danny, because in the legislation or the bills that CCL pushes forward, this is something that you all are really supportive of, and you're doing that work. Can you see your organization actually reviewing this and actually talking through this as being something that you would actually structure in your legislation?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, like Dr. Sheets was talking about, that there's the position that New Jersey is taking, and EJ groups in New Jersey are taking in the Northeast to achieve certain political outcomes. And that's certainly what we've been doing as well. I mean, we have found that by being so specific, remember, we have two goals: the political will and the empowerment. By being so specific with the policy, we really empower our volunteers. Having that specificity enables regular people who are in our organization, they can really sink their teeth into it. And when they go into the meetings with the members of Congress, because it's so specific, they find that oftentimes they know more than the congressional staffer that they're meeting with. And so by being so specific, that performs a very specific role in the empowerment of our volunteers. And so that's one element. I think that it also helps in terms of just pushing the moment forward and building momentum for the moment when Congress is ready to discuss this. We're almost clear to a fault on what we're willing to, what we want. There's a lot of messages, but the reality is we want to get emissions down, and we want low-income Americans to end up ahead. Those are our bottom lines. And there's a lot of flexibility in once you get to the point of sausage making in how to do that. As long as you're clearing those two bottom lines, we're going to be all for it. And I think that if you're including this in the regulatory language would absolutely be something that we're interested. Our volunteers are very passionate about people doing better. And so I think to answer your question, Tina, yeah, this is absolutely something that we'd love to talk about. And we'd love to see something in the bill we support, whether that's when it's reintroduced or whether that's in the committee process. Let's talk about it, but we'd be happy to help get this done.
Great, thank you. Dr. Sheets?
Well, yeah, good question. Let me start off by saying we haven't been faced with that question yet because nobody has, it hasn't even risen to the level where anybody said, well, you know what, say with the Transportation and Climate Initiative, nobody came to us and said, you know what, we are going to develop these programs, and it will have to be more than a promise. We're going to develop these programs and have them ready to go, and that the carbon trading system is not going to go forward unless these programs go forward. And we know exactly what the programs are. We know what emissions reduction is going to occur, and nothing else is going to happen until they happen. Nobody's come to us with that yet, Tina. So we haven't had anything to decide. Now, if someone came to us with that, then I think we'd have to discuss it. Now, having said that, I will say, and that's why I said the last time in New Jersey, we've been very careful by saying that, if you include this in it, that doesn't mean we're endorsing the market-based mechanism. Because I will tell you now, I presented from kind of a New Jersey perspective what we emphasize. But remember what I said before, I think further questions are, with a market-based mechanism, I mean, the values of that mechanism are cost. Do you want to embrace that to get emissions reductions? And I presented what kind of Danny said, the bottom line, what our bottom line has been in New Jersey. I guarantee you, if you go to IEN, the Indigenous Environmental Network, their bottom line would not only be emissions reduction, they would have a more holistic approach and say, look, you are commodifying a market-based mechanism to commodify the environment. And that in and of itself is wrong. So, because you shouldn't be putting a price on the atmosphere, on the land, on the soil. That's just not right. So I think, Tina, that if we were ever presented with that, we would have to have, some discussion within the EJ community, which in and of itself, as you know, Tina, is not easy. but I will just say, at least we've gotten to the point, and I don't know if Bev's still on the line, at least we've gotten to the point over a dozen years where people, Danny's even saying that, and Derek was even saying that, because when we met with other groups, big green groups back in 2008, nobody was saying that. So, so we'd have to strongly consider it, and we'd have to have internal discussions in the EJ community.
I just want to jump in on that because earlier when I was talking about the big failure a decade ago, it really was Waxman-Markey not having an approach that really even acknowledged the central role that I think we now feel strongly equity and justice needs to play in climate policy. And so I think that it would be terrific to. I'm going to hold that what you said, Dr. Sheets, about including direct pollution reductions in EJ communities is not. It's not a price of support. It's almost like a price of admission. Like we shouldn't even have a conversation about a policy if it doesn't include that. And I think there should be a conversation not only about how to improve pollution or reduce or eliminate pollution in EJ communities, but on the flip side, what is the best way that you can also reduce and control the pollution that causes climate change at the same time? And the answer, we actually don't know the answer, because as you said, there hasn't been a market-based mechanism yet that proposes to do that in a real way. There is a provision in the Colorado bill that was passed in 2019 that requires the Colorado to deliver local pollution reductions in EJ communities as part of its overall greenhouse gas plan. But that is essentially a regulatory process that's just getting underway. And it's one state, and they haven't been elaborated yet. And so, it is going to take, to some extent, I think, the kind of, I don't want to call them case studies, but things like the cumulative impacts law in New Jersey, which is the best example, things like the community pollution control measures in California around AB 617, which some of you may have heard of, which also probably needs to be substantially improved, but has some kernels of, if you say, wisdom associated with them, in that they do get at cumulative impacts as well. I think there are some places to build here, but there's not an actual example out there of where things have been successfully married in a way that should give confidence to no matter what your values are, no matter what your policy outcomes, this is still in development. But I think what we know is that equity and justice can't be an afterthought. It can't be left to chance. And we certainly, EDF has been guilty in the past, and not with bad intention, but we've been guilty of leaving it to chance. And that's not acceptable.
I just like to say I'm excited that I threw out something that Dr. Sheets hadn't heard before. And I think that to me signals there's still room for creativity.
No, I've heard it before.
We've heard it before.
In theory, but we've never been confronted with it in practice. So
Okay.
like I said, with TCI, the Transportation and Climate Initiative, that was not put on the table. In New Jersey with Reggie, that was not put on the table. It's just never been put on the table in reality. And I think from the EJ perspective, what we'd have to ask is, I mean, we think what we're talking about is better suited to a regulatory system, because we're really talking about the hybrid system. We're talking about adding regulations to a market-based system is really what we're talking about.
That's what, yeah.
So then I think the question we would ask would be, well, why not just go with the regulatory system then? But to be, all those things would be up in the air if we were ever confronted with it.
Yeah.
I don't
find that
see
exciting.
I don't see any other hands raised at the moment, so I'm going to ask another question. So I'm actually really curious about the climate mitigation, the integration of how climate mitigation actually works with the cumulative impacts, by having cumulative impacts integrated into the actual policy. And the reason I'm asking this question is because this, to me, I keep thinking, how can you get environmental justice into the actual climate policy, not just at the subnational level or the state and local level or the federal government level, but also in the international spaces like the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework on Climate Change. When we talk about climate policy, we talk about mitigation, we talk about adaptation, but we aren't speaking about this in this way. And I just wanted to hear some thoughts on that, because it seems like it's low-hanging fruit, it has potential, and that it sort of not codifies, but it brings together this very clear need to look at equity and justice. And I call it the framework of environmental justice being that framework by which we develop our climate policy. So yeah.
So I'm glad you asked that, Tina. And I think I've caused some confusion. Maybe I'm not clear. I'm not actually suggesting that we integrate cumulative impacts policy in the climate change policy. Now, that may be a way to go. I'd have to think about it more, but that's not really what I'm suggesting. When I talk about cumulative impacts at the beginning of my presentation, I talk about it to motivate the need to use climate change mitigation policy to address a portion of the cumulative impacts problem, right? And distinguish that from the law in New Jersey, cumulative impacts law, specifically uses the concept of cumulative impacts and cumulative impact analysis, right, to fight that problem. But when I talk about climate change mitigation policy, I'm not necessarily talking about integrating cumulative impact analysis into that policy. What I'm saying is, because of cumulative impacts, we're going to need multiple policies to address cumulative impacts. And one type of policy will be climate change mitigation policy. Another type of policy, I was just talking about this with EJHA, Environmental Justice Health Alliance, Michelle Roberts. Another type of policy that we're going to need to address cumulative impacts will be chemical security policy, or policy to address the chemical plants. We're going to need that also as part of a suite of policies to address cumulative impacts, as well as cumulative impacts policies that directly try to come to grips with cumulative impacts policies and use cumulative impact analysis. So I really use cumulative impacts to motivate the need to use climate change mitigation policy to address disproportionate pollution in EJ communities. Because there has been, over the years, massive pushback against that. You're hearing Derek and Danny talk about it now and say, that's interesting. Yeah, but 10 years ago, the answer was no.
Yeah.
Just no. We'll address that through the NAC standards, through other means, but don't come and mess with our climate change mitigation policy. I don't know if that's clear, I hope.
No, that is clear, and that's helpful clarification for me. I think that you did say it properly, and maybe I interpreted it differently in my brain. But it does sound like there are several opportunities for one, further discussion and evaluation of existing policies and approaches, but also opportunities to rethink. I like the word reform or reimagine. This approach, and I think that is sort of the question I was asking you, Danny, was sort of, is CCL open to rethinking its approach? Because it does really great work as far as getting the community that you work with engaged and involved, and it sounds like yes. And I hear you saying, Derek, the same, like it's something that we're thinking about, we need to be engaging in. And I hear you saying, Nikki, the same, like, hey, we're open to these things. There are definitely some things that we are clear about when we're looking at this approach. And so I want to give each of you a moment just to kind of have last words. And the question I have for each of you is, what would be your hope in having a carbon pricing mechanism or this economic tool? What would be your hope in how it would move forward? Because it is something that is being talked about and considered in a way that is focused in equity and justice. So what would be your hope in how this particular policy issue would move forward through a lens, I mean, very specific here, of equity and justice? And I'll call on you, Danny, first.
Yeah, well, one thing that I raised to the top of mind for our volunteers this Saturday was the fact that the EU, the European Union, has announced that they have a carbon price, and they have had for some time, and they're going to include a border carbon adjustment starting on January 1st of 2023, which means that this coming Congress is literally the only Congress that has a chance of legislating to give businesses the ability to respond to that. I think that's going to be a strong motivator for Republicans in particular to address this through this lens. And my hope would be that I think there's room for creativity, and there's room to come together, and there's room to make sure that equity and justice are manifested in this policy type. I think it's going to remain at the center a lot of ways of the discussion. And so my hope is that we're together able to be clear and about what needs to happen, and that together we're able to generate the political will to get what needs to get done.
Great, thanks. Derek?
Well, I'm just grateful for the gift of everyone's time today. I think what I'm looking forward to is not only being a better ally on equity and justice, but also making sure that we're in learning mode and supporting mode as much as possible. And, it's very clear what Dr. Sheets has laid out, some of the questions and criteria that he has laid out. But, big organizations like EDF with big budgets need to figure out a way to help support local communities speaking for themselves in forums where decisions are made, not going off and taking the lessons and insights that we hear in conversations like this and then repeating them. So I'm really hoping for increased opportunities to learn from and understand from folks on this call how the insights and resources and expertise that we have can be put to use in support of a different kind of agenda, some kind of a 2.0 agenda from what we've looked at historically as our core mission.
Great. Nikki, you have the last word.
Well, I'm gonna be careful about here, Tina, about this. I mean, I think first, local EJ organizations need to take into account their own political situations and what political power they have and decide where they want to go. I'm mainly concerned about the emissions reductions. I'm not ready to say or endorse that, hey, we need to work on combining the systems. In spite of what, I've been presented, the tactic we take in New Jersey is that if we can't stop the market-based mechanism, and we don't think it fits New Jersey, then, we'll look at what to do then. But I think there has to be a lot of discussion, I would just say within the EJ community, about where we want to go strategically. And I'm certainly not going to get out ahead of the EJ community on that. Right?
Perfect.
And
Yep.
A lot of discussion to come.
Okay, yeah, perfect. Great sum up, gentlemen. Thank you for your time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Our next webinar is next Tuesday, and the following one is on Thursday. So the one on Tuesday is on the re-entering the Paris Agreement. So we'll be having an international discussion on what that means for the US from both the domestic perspective and then from the international perspective. So have a great weekend, everyone. Thank you all so very much. This was great, wonderful. From the bottom of my heart, thank you, thank you. And to our participants, thank you all as well. Bye, everyone.
Thank
Bye,
you.
take care.
Bye.
Hi, sorry, it's Grace from React. I'm sorry to be a pain in the butt, but I just don't want to